Prime Minister Mark Carney is laying out his plan for Canada to be its own best customer. Today, the Prime Minister revealed more details on the Liberals' Buy Canadian policy as they try to use federal dollars to boost demand for tariff-strapped Canadian industries.
Whenever the federal government spends, we will select Canadian suppliers by default. And in those cases, when domestic suppliers aren't available, purchases will be required to include Canadian content or to be sourced from trusted partners. And those cases will be the exception, not the norm. And they will require ministerial approval.
To put the Canadian requirements in place, the Liberals are giving $98.2 million to the Federal Procurement Office over the next 5 years. They're also promising to leverage up to $70 billion in infrastructure spending to drive Canadian purchases and to apply the new policies in the Major Projects Office, Build Canada Homes, and the Defence Investment Agency. So, will this be a lifeline for industry or more regulation that slows down Canadian projects? Mélanie Joly is the Minister of Industry, and she joins me now. Minister, welcome back to the show. We appreciate your time.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Help me understand some of the specifics of this. What would a Crown corporation or a government department have to do to prove it can't buy Canadian? Because the onus to buy Canadian seems pretty clear, but what would be a possible exception here?
So, well, there are some things that we don't manufacture, that we just don't produce in Canada. So that would be the exception to the rule, and then when that's the case, what we'll do is we'll make sure that there can be Canadian content in what is then manufactured abroad. I'll give you an example. Obviously, the best example right now is with the submarines and the 12 submarines that we want to buy. This is a huge procurement, the second biggest for our Defence Department for our Canadian Armed Forces. It's the second after the F-35s, and so in that sense, what we're asking either from TKMS, which is a German company, a German-Norwegian consortium, or Onwa, which is a South Korean company, is to show that they can create jobs in Canada, that they can support through their supply chain Canadian companies. So that's the idea. Okay,
but what about where does price and delivery timelines fit into this? Because you could have, an infrastructure project where maybe the Canadian option is simply way more expensive than an international option, or they can't deliver it at scale, at least in the early stages of this transition. Does that become a factor there, or is it even if it's more expensive and slower, you have to do it?
Well, I think it's a balance, because it's important that we look into, obviously, prices, but it's important also that we support our jobs at home. You know, David, what we're facing right now is protectionism all around the world. The U.S. has an important America First procurement policy. Many countries also in Europe are working on that, EU as well. So we're trying to tread a needle, which is we have these companies that are affected by unjustified and unjustifiable tariffs in the steel, in aluminum, in the lumber sector, and we need to find a way to create a domestic market. We need to create jobs and at the same time protect jobs that we already have. So that's why we're coming up with a bill, a Buy Canadian policy, which is extremely important, which will help build our country even stronger.
So, I understand the motivation here and to offset the economic damage that's being done by all of this, but does it mean sort of the value for money principle that you kind of want to have in tender bids and in competitions to get the lowest cost possible, that you have to set that aside to some degree because of the need for economic activity and to use government spending to help spur economic activity in Canadian companies?
Well, your question is a good one, but you're presenting it as if it's either or. I think what I've heard from many, many Canadian companies is there's frustration with not being even able to have access to Canadian contracts, not even being able to bid. And that's a difference in culture that we're bringing up today, that we will look at working with Canadian companies, that we can also help them when we give them a contract. Well, they can then invest and they can hire and they can have some predictability on how they can continue to build their own companies. And I've seen it many, many, many times. A lot of big companies have access to Canadian procurement because also they have an entire department that knows how to navigate the bureaucracy in Ottawa, which doesn't make sense. So what we're doing right now is we're saying we will buy Canadian first, and we will also help our companies to have access to Canadian procurement, and also to cut red tape. It's just the right thing to do right now.
So Minister, how do you do this? Because, you know, it is an element of protectionism here to fight the larger global trend of protectionism and still comply with the free trade agreements that you've signed, not just with the U.S. I'm thinking of the European Union, for example, because CETA demands equal treatment in high-value contracts and in bidding for European companies when it comes to bidding on government procurement. So how do you do this without running afoul of your trade agreement with a good trading partner in Europe?
And we'll continue to have these conversations with Europe. See, I'll give you an example. Europe just came up with some very stringent norms regarding which type of steel can go into the European Union, with very protectionist measures, because they're facing a real challenge to their steel industry. And they've imposed 25% tariffs also. And meanwhile, what we're trying to do right now is to make sure that we're keeping a relationship with Europe, and that we can continue to have access to Europe. And we're in discussion also with the European Union to make sure that Canadian steel and aluminum can continue to go into Europe. And meanwhile, we will try to reciprocate, but we are all trying to thread the needle here, because we're all reacting to US protectionism. And I had a conversation with the Minister of the Economy of Europe, which is my counterpart, Stéphane Séjourné, and we had that conversation. This is all new to all of us, but we also need to protect our own sectors in our own countries, because obviously if that's not the case, there will be too many jobs lost, and we don't accept that. And Canadians won't accept that. So when I presented the vision for Canadian industries, I said, the first thing we need to do is protect jobs. And while we're protecting jobs, we'll also work on creating jobs and attracting talent and investment. And when talking about protecting jobs, I said, short term, we need to protect our market. Middle term, we need to have our companies adapt and pivot to new markets and new products. And longer term, we need to have a stronger domestic market. And what you're seeing today is the fact that we are coming up with a new Buy Canadian policy, which will be put into place starting this month and completed by spring of 2026, to make sure that we buy Canadian lumber, Canadian steel, and Canadian aluminum, and that we support our companies that are struggling with tariffs.
But Minister, my understanding that as you try to thread this needle, to use your phrase, you've been talking to the Europeans. Do you see the potential for a collision here with the trade agreements? Because I appreciate everyone's adjusting, and these trade agreements were signed in a different age compared to today. But do you see the potential for collision? Because I know the budget talks about changing how certain Canadian trade tribunals work. It seems like you have to make legislative changes to immunize the government for this policy to work.
Well, you know, we're doing both at the same time. So we're coming up with this Buy Canadian policy is really, really important. And meanwhile, we're having conversation with new trading partners. And it's not either nor. We have to be able to do both. And I'm having a G7 industry ministers in December in Montreal. And we will have these conversations, particularly with Europe and particularly with Japan, because that's exactly what we need to do. We need to be able to protect our jobs and meanwhile build an economic bloc with countries that believe in free trade, that are able to trust each other, that can rely on free trade agreements. But right now, there are clearly questions as to how we can support these free trade agreements, while a lot of governments are taking very much protectionist measures. And so the world is being reshaped. You know, the Prime Minister has been saying there are lots of things we can't control and things we can control. and we will focus on what we can control, and this Buy Canadian policy is all about that.
Okay, it's easy for me to see how this would work with, say, Build Canada Homes or with infrastructure through the Department of Infrastructure. Yep. But the press release from the Prime Minister's office says the Buy Canadian policy will apply to the work of the Major Projects Office to fast-track transformative energy, trade, and transportation projects across the country. Does this mean the projects that get fast-tracked have to adhere to a Buy Canadian policy, even if it's a private sector proponent? How does that work?
So I had conversations already with key companies that will, for example, build an LNG pipeline. Well, of course, we want them to take Canadian steel. We want them to be able to buy Canadian steel because it will support Canadian workers. And that's good news for the sector. Now, a lot of these steel plants don't necessarily do the type of steel that the company needs for the pipeline. And so I'm working with the steel plants to put money on the table, to retool them to make sure that they'll do the right type of steel. So that's the job I'm doing, along with the private sector and along also with a lot of the proponents from major, that have major projects. I'll give you another example. You've talked about major projects. I'll talk to you about our defense investments. We want to invest even more in aerospace, in military aerospace. Well, we know that that will have an impact on the aluminum sector or also on the steel sector. We cannot let go these strengths. If Canada at one point was facing a major international conflict, we would need to defend ourselves, and we can only be able to defend ourselves if we have steel and aluminum produced in this country. And we cannot pretend that we can be a very strong economic power in the world if we don't have steel or aluminum. So that's why we're finding ways to protect these industries, and the Buy Canadian policy that you're asking me questions about is actually about that.
Okay, but just help me understand a little bit more specifically on the Major Projects Office. If you're designated a project of national interest, does that mean you have to adhere to this Buy Canadian policy? Because I can understand why the government might pay higher prices for domestic economic activity, but a private sector company with shareholders and a fiduciary responsibility, that's a tougher pill to swallow. So how does is it just in public infrastructure work that goes through that office, or is it everything that goes through that office?
The goal is to make sure in the end that they take they use Canadian steel, Canadian aluminum, and Canadian lumber, for sure. Okay. That's been the goal. Now,
but what if a company thinks it's
it,
too expensive, for example?
The goal is to make sure that they take our Canadian steel and Canadian aluminum. And these conversations have already started. Because companies understand that they need to do their own work, that they need to contribute, that we're building one strong country, and it's part of the deal of being able to be a major project is actually to spur economic benefits across the country. That's exactly why Prime Minister Carney came up with this idea of major projects and being able to fast track them, because we need to do that to create economic growth at a time where we're dealing with trade tensions and a complicated, to say the least, southern neighbor. So that's why, of course, it's part of the conversations, and and the conversations are not only happening between the government and the private sector. The proponents of these major projects, may they be mining or resources type of projects, they're also happening between the companies, so between steel plants or aluminum plants and lumber companies, and also the proponents. So that's also happening.
Okay, so just a final question, because I know I've gone over time. So I know you say it's a goal to get people to use steel and aluminum, but is it a requirement if it's a major project? Because a goal, is not as enforceable, obviously, as a requirement. So help me understand, which would it be at this point?
I understand your question, because right now the type of steel that is done in Canada, a lot of it was linked to the U.S. auto sector in the U.S., obviously south of the border. And so a lot of our plants are coming up with new projects to change the type of steel, to make sure that they can adapt. That needs investments. That's where I come in, and my team and I come in to support these investments. That's why we have a strategic response fund of $5 billion to help that pivot, maybe at ArcelorMittal, Dofasco in Hamilton, Stelco, or also the Algoma Steel, so St. Marie plant. So we'll do that with them in order for them afterwards to be able to have an ATCO pipeline project order, or to be able to build the rails that are required for the high-speed rail between Toronto and Quebec. So we are in this transition, but this Buy Canadian policy is really, really important because it shows that that's where we're heading, and these will be the conditions that we'll be putting on the table.
Okay. Industry Minister Mélanie Joly, we always appreciate the time. Thank you for being here today.
It's a pleasure. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Well, Mark Carney was out promoting the budget today, outlining his plan to make Canada its own best customer through a Buy Canadian policy, an effort meant to make Canada less reliant on the U.S. and to prop up Canadian businesses during the trade war. But as the Prime Minister sells the budget, one of his own MPs is pointing out some of its flaws.
First, stalled climate action, cutting tree planting, moving away from an emissions cap, winding down greener homes. No new money for climate action. On housing, it falls short of these specific promises in our platform, and it unfortunately falls well short of the wartime effort that many of us thought we'd deliver. The budget adds $140 billion in new spending over 5 years, $90 billion net after savings, and only 36% of the net new spending is capital. My kids shouldn't pay for today's military or for me to save $400 of income taxes. We see the budget commit to a new inefficient fossil fuel subsidy for LNG facilities. We do not need more public dollars chasing fossil fuels. Worse, we see major cuts of over $2.5 billion over 4 years to international development assistance. Overall, the budget meets the moment in part, but fairly, it does not live up to its promise of generational investments.
Okay, Vandana, that's like Scott Aitchison, Elizabeth May, and Don Davies had a kid, because it's sort of all of their criticisms all at once. I'm pretty sure Nate Erskine-Smith is a Liberal member of Parliament. I may need to double check, but what do you make of that messaging coming from the caucus?
Yeah, and I would say there are elements of this video in full where he also compliments the budget, so if people want to check it out. And I'll give two perspectives. One, in my old job, when I was in Prime Minister's office, I did hate this. I wanted people to say one message. But having from the outside, I would say it's actually really important, especially as you alluded to, the current makeup of the Conservative caucus, that while he has criticisms that I think are fairly fair on the budget. I think it's important that in one caucus, you could have someone having criticisms and have a robust discussion on the budget. He is accountable to the people who elected him. And in Beaches East York, there are people who will care about those issues. So he is talking about them. He says positive things about the budget as well. But I think that's actually healthy for democracy. If you are too hyper-partisan and people are just become clapping seals behind the Prime Minister, that's not credible for Canadians. So I think for Canadians, they feel comfort that someone like Nathaniel Erskine-Smith is part of the caucus, that he can raise these issues, that he can drive some policy, that he has influence. So I think that's actually better, especially as we're talking about hyper-partisanship, what is possible for us, what is best for Canadians. I think this is actually something that will cause comfort for Canadians, that you can have this conversation in the kind of caucus, and that perhaps the Prime Minister will listen to those kind of points that Nathaniel Erskine-Smith brought forward.
Brad, what do you make of that? I mean, Vandana is right. There is more to that video, but it's like 4.5 minutes long. So, we can't play the whole thing. And that's not a criticism. Like, Nate Erskine-Smith is a pretty effective communicator in this medium. And while, yes, there are things he does like, there are clear points there about the falling short. The housing thing in particular, it's exactly what Scott Aitchison, the Conservative critic, and Mike Moffat, who does work in the space, said. It is a retreat from the election promises to now, right?
Yeah. So if anybody wants to know why Nate Erskine-Smith is not in cabinet, this would be an example of that. Now, to Vandana's point about how, it's a democracy and all that good stuff, 100%, and yes, he's outlining criticisms from each of the three opposition parties that you've outlined. But, being in caucus and being in government is also a team sport. And right now, the Prime Minister, for Liberal MPs, their job is not to highlight to highlight the inadequacies. It's to promote the aspects that the Prime Minister wants. The opposition's job is to highlight that which is in there. So I'm all in favor of having MPs stand up for their constituents. There was nothing about his particular riding that he really spoke to. He spoke of general Canadian ones. Not helpful for the Prime Minister or the sales job that the cabinet has on this. And team players, unfortunately, those that rogue individual MPs don't get a lot of sway within caucus because they can't be counted on to pull together as a team.
Well, Kate, Brad is right. Politics is theoretically a team sport. Maybe if you want to run for Ontario Liberal leader, you might do things to carve out your own brand. But this is still a Liberal member of Parliament criticizing the Liberal government in pretty significant ways, while the Prime Minister is out selling it.
Yeah, geez, Nate, could you not have released that video any earlier just to take some of the heat off of the blue team and just people that were dissatisfied with the approach of their caucus? Yeah. No, I think that Brad is quite right. It is a team sport, and I'll just use a corporate analogy here. There's often a lot of debate and discussion amongst the senior management team before a decision is made and taken by the CEO. That is the opportunity, if you are a member of the government, to raise your concerns and try to push for what it is your constituents want to see or what your business line might want to see, if I'm sticking with a corporate analogy. And so everybody goes into that boardroom, they says their piece, and then they leave with whatever the decision is made by the CEO. And so the opportunity for Nathaniel Erskine-Smith to have those concerns came and went. And I think that, it's not to suggest that he has to dilute his perspective or his objective on certain issues. This is not the first time that he has, stepped out of line with the party line and the caucus line. But at the same time, you show that you are a part of the team by supporting the leader and supporting the decisions that are taken, and then letting your constituents know that you're going to keep pushing on these issues and keep fighting for their interests, even if it's not the decision that was necessarily taken in last week's budget.
Rob, I think corporate analogies are appropriate when talking about the management style of this government, but Nate Erskine-Smith is no longer on that board, right? He was in cabinet, and now he's back in the backbench. So I don't know if he gets that input up front, but he certainly has made his opinions known now. Is this damaging for them at all?
As a scribbler and a babbler who has complained about backbench MPs being reduced to the role of trained seals balancing a ball on their nose and barking their approval whenever required as a backdrop, we've got to find it refreshing. We do, because
when people speak honestly, it's always better.
That's right. And so if you have good relationships with backbench MPs on both sides of the aisle, this is the kind of thing that you hear. And in the end, he says he's going to support the budget, in fact, right? He's not going to vote against it, but you're getting a look at what really some backbench MPs, a lot of them, might be thinking. And actually, I thought it was fairly solid analysis, and I say that as someone who risks getting bounced out of the studio and replaced by Nate Erskine-Smith in the power panel.
Yeah, well, I mean, Vandana, it also, I think, in some ways, shows the transition in policy and focus the party is going through right now, does it not? Like the things Nate Erskine-Smith was talking about there, obviously they're very core to the type of liberal he is, right? The generational fairness, climate action, and aggressiveness on housing. Not saying those don't apply to Prime Minister Carney, but they're not the way they were under, say, Justin Trudeau, at least as a leading item.
Yeah, I mean, every iteration of a budget is different, and a budget won't be everything to everybody, right? So you'll make certain decisions. As someone who's once signed off on budget decisions, there's always something more you can add. There's always something, a new program that could be added or a new way of looking at things. This is currently where Prime Minister Carney wants to go. He wants to bet on long-term investment. He wants to bet on, working with private sector and different levels of government to help catalyze the economy. And I think he's really focused on that. And the big pieces that you could argue haven't been focused on the last 10 years as well. Like, as to Nate Erskine-Smith's point, there's different focuses. But I think that's okay. I think there are young progressives in this party, whether as members or as young staff or other members as well. But I think for them to see Nathaniel Erskine-Smith saying these things, I don't think that harms the Liberal brand. While it can be annoying, but I do know, and I've heard this directly from the Prime Minister shortly after he won, he does believe the caucus doesn't have to say the same thing. That for them to be authentic to their voters and to their party brand overall, they have to be able to share what their constituents are concerned of and what they're able to talk about.
Well, look, Brad, if that is a real operating principle, I think that's a good thing for Canadian politics, right? That you can have disagreement and move from the orthodoxy within reasonable levels of criticism, you know, in terms of the conversation and the debate. I mean, Nate Erskine-Smith is still voting for this budget. He's still supporting it. But I can see when question period comes back and the vote happens on the 17th, the Conservatives quoting him back to his boss, you know, in their critique of the spending plan.
Yeah, I think it's fine to have. Of course, it's fine to have differences within caucus or within cabinet. But you know, once those are aired, there has to be one face of the government or of a budget. Doesn't matter what stripe this is. If you know, all you're doing is enabling the opposition to further harm and further distract from your chief spokesperson's message, whether it's a prime minister or a premier. This, you know, we'd say this at the provincial level as well. You can't sign up and say, I would like all of the spoils of running under this team, but then whenever I want to, I can step outside for reasons I still don't see what the benefit that he gets by doing this. I only see harm to his team and to his boss. And aiding and abetting the opposition and critics. I don't see how this advances any of those. What he should have been doing is advocating for those before the budget was finalized. I didn't hear him advocating for more international aid or any of the other things that he talked about prior to the budget. Now that it's done, you know, he's now criticizing those cuts. Again, lots to criticize about the budget, but when you're in government, you gotta play on the team that you're a member of. You can't pull in and out whenever you want to. The structure, the system isn't built for that.
Kate, I see you nodding along. Is Nate Erskine-Smith united the New Democrat and the Conservative in a similar viewpoint on this? Is that what's happening here?
Yes, uniter in chief. No, I think that there's really two things at play. The first one is Nathaniel Erskine-Smith's own ambitions. And, you know, he's been pretty clear that he's at least kicking the tires at perhaps another run at the Ontario Liberal Party. And they really are poised to make gains at the expense of the NDP. So it's not strange, I think, that he would be flexing some of his progressive bona fides as that party goes through a leadership review and a race at the Ontario provincial level. But the other piece of this, of course, is that Nathaniel Erskine-Smith is part of the team. You know, he has a misalignment, I think, right now that a lot of progressives may be feeling in the party. We just talked about, you know, do red Tories have a home in the Conservative Party? I think there might be a lot of progressive liberals, I'll call them terracotta liberals, people that might go orange and red. Where do they fit into the Carney government and to the objectives that are being put forward there? So Nathaniel Erskine-Smith is not the only person that that may fall into that camp that's in caucus or even necessarily cabinet. And certainly, to Vandana's point, a lot of the younger people that support the Liberal Party. So I think that might be something that the Carney government may continue to grapple with. You see them trying to kind of have it both ways on environmental policy, for example, but we may see more Nathaniel Erskine-Smith in terms of discontent with moving away from some more of those progressive policy banners that were carried by the previous Trudeau administration.
Yeah, Rob, last 20 seconds, there's a lot of maybe shifting in voter coalition and who you're targeting based on where you are in your leadership right now.
Yeah, I think we've all kind of touched on it in terms of the vacancy at Queen's Park. There's not a Liberal leader right now. But when I spoke to some Liberals, Ontario Liberals over the weekend, they said this is the kind of behavior that makes us have some misgivings about him. Is he an unguided missile? Can he keep a caucus together? Can he unite a party that's down in the dumps right now?
Yeah, and the supporters will point to the authenticity and these sorts of things, but who knows, right? Because it's been a rough ride for the Ontario Liberal Party. All right, we got to leave it there. Vandana Cotter, Kate Harrison, Brad Levine, united in this one, and Rob Russo.